During the Second World War, Winston Churchill was quoted as saying, "Never let a good crisis go to waste."
Target had got back. That is the final whistle. And Burnley, I'm afraid, are relegated. It's been a real fight. They took it to the last day. But Burnley are down to the championship.
In the summer of 2022, Burnley Football Club were in crisis. The club had been relegated to the Championship from the Premier League on the last match day of the 21-22 season, ending a 6-year spell in the top division. The relegation was overseen by caretaker manager Michael Jackson, after long-term gaffer Sean Dyche was sacked in April. The relegation activated a clause which meant the club now had payable debts of over £50 million via a controversial takeover in late 2020. And there was a mass exodus of players including captain Ben Mee, England internationals James Tarkowski and Nick Pope, that season's top scorer Maxwell Cornet, as well as young talent like Nathan Collins and Dwight McNeil. Many feared the worst for Burnley.
Leeds have stayed up, brilliant for them. Burnley have gone down. I fear for Burnley. Financially, this is going to be an implosion for Burnley.
So you've now got a situation where you fear for Burnley. I'm not saying they can't bounce back.
Burnley! Brilliant! And there's a goal for Ian Matson. Do here, hooks it back. 2-0! What a goal! Digs it in towards the back post. Burnley win that. 1-0 Clarence. Together. Here's Zaroury into the box, looking to take men on. One coming on his right foot. Oh, the goal! Oh, what a finish! Into the box now, Brownhill. He's looking for Barnes. Can he finish it? He can! Goodmanson to hit it. It's it well! 1-0 Burnley! Matson to hit it. Good effort. Oh, Ian Matson. What a free kick that is. Chance here. And he scores. Sends the keeper the wrong way. And Burnley lead. Finds a ball for Obafemi, if he can keep it in play. Hooks it back for Foster. Oh, great goal. Super goal. Hooks it back in. And Burnley are back ahead. And that's to Clarence, and it's Roberts from a couple of yards out.
Burnley are back in the Premier League.
These were the scenes from Turf Moor as Burnley lifted the Championship Winners' Trophy at home after one of the greatest seasons in the club's history. Burnley simply blew teams away at times this season, perfectly executing the plan of new manager, former Manchester City captain and legend Vincent Kompany. The work done by Kompany and his team was simply miraculous. Burnley won the league at the home of their greatest rivals Blackburn with 2 games to spare, finishing 21 points ahead of third and becoming only the 4th team to amass over 100 points in the Championship since its formation in 2004. The driving force behind this season's success was the recruitment done in the summer. Over a 2-month period, Burnley signed 13 players, tapping into the Belgian market for hidden gems like Josh Cullen, Vitinho and Anas Sayori, as well as bringing in loan players like Nathan Teller, Taylor Harwood-Bellis, Ian Matson and Jordan Beyer. Combine these acquisitions with what remained of the previous season's squad and players brought in to fit the system to create, once it got going, by far and away the best team in the second division. The transformation into a possession-based team is even more remarkable given the Brexit ball tag Burnley were labelled as under old manager Sean Dyche. This is the 4th time Burnley have achieved promotion to the Premier League, winning the Championship playoffs in 2009, finishing 2nd in 2014 and 1st in 2016. This level of involvement in the modern top flight would have been unthinkable in the mid-1980s. Burnley at the time found themselves staring at the abyss, potentially being relegated out of the Football League in 1987. The entire season and possible future of the club rested on one game, known today as the Orient Game. To understand the Orient Game, we should go back and start in the glory days. Despite the reputation Burnley gained under Dyche, the club and town are one of football's great innovators. Burnley was one of the first teams to turn professional, were a founding member of the Football League, and were one of the first to have a purpose-built training ground. Even the concept of total football has its origins from a local lad, which in a roundabout way inspired the current Burnley manager. It was this total football style which former Burnley manager Harry Potts implemented for the 1959-60 season. This style led the team into the final game of the season, away versus Manchester City at Main Road, knowing a win would see them crowned champions of England for just the 2nd time. Burnley lined up in their usual formation for that season and featured international quality players such as Jimmy McIlroy, Brian Miller and 1966 World Cup winner John Connolly. It was a tight game, but goals from Brian Pilkington and Trevor Meredith saw Burnley win 2-1. The result was huge for the town of only 80,000 inhabitants, one of the smallest populations to win a top flight title. As the town came out to celebrate, it would be impossible to think, within a generation, the team will be on the brink of going out of business. But away trips to Hereford and Aldershot would need to wait as equally glamorous fixtures await the reigning champions. The title led Burnley to enter the 1960-61 European Cup. A two-legged win over French champion Stade Reims led Burnley to face German giants Hamburg in the second round. A 3-1 victory at Turf Moor, followed by a 4-1 loss in Hamburg, meant Burnley were out of Europe's premier competition, but did at least make a good showing of themselves. The team finished fourth in their title defence season, another good showing, but more notable were the events off the pitch that season as, on the 18th of January 1961, in my opinion, the start of Burnley's as well as many other smaller teams' downfall began. This was the day the £20 per limit wage cap was removed in the Football League. This deregulation of the market would mean richer, larger clubs will be able to offer players more, making it harder for smaller, less financially affluent teams to hold on to players. For smaller clubs, the fear would be that they will be stuck in a downward spiral. This is what I refer to as the football death spiral. By having a lower budget than other clubs, who you are ultimately competing against, you naturally achieve worse results, as the better players congregate at richer clubs. Worse results and the team playing poorly leads to less fans wanting to spend their disposable income coming to matches. Lower attendances leads to less revenue in tickets and merchandise sales. This lower revenue leads to lower profits, which means a lower budget. A lower budget leads to worse players and results. Worse results leads to lower attendances. Lower attendances leads to lower revenue. Lower revenue leads to lower budget. Lower budget leads to worse results. Worse results leads to lower attendances. Burnley adapted to the deregulation of wages by implementing a new strategy, youth only. It is a method that's still used today by most clubs. The plan is as follows. Step 1. Sign a young, unproven player who is not on the bigger team's radar or would likely not start for a bigger club. Step 2. Train the player and give them first team experience until they become a much better player. Step 3. Sell said player to a bigger club for a profit. Step 4. Repeat by reinvesting in a new, young player. This strategy has proved to be a success for many clubs and can even help when a team is relegated to help them eventually bounce back, like what Burnley did in the 22-23 season. However, this strategy is dependent on continuously bringing in young players and having good scouting to identify the hidden gems. Now, at this point in the story, I feel it's appropriate to introduce the Burnley owner at the time, Bob Lord. Back in the day when a local butcher could buy a football club, Bob Lord was one of the most famous owners in the country. Appointed Burnley chairman in 1955, he oversaw the most successful period in the history of the club. However, despite his success, he is seen as a controversial figure in modern times, due to his business decisions and some remarks he made during his lifetime. His running of business at Burnley led him to being given the name Khrushchev. It was his way or the highway. Lord's preferred method for running the club was to invest in infrastructure, and he favoured young players and internal recruitment rather than spending on big names. This could be seen when he once again got his way in 1962. In that summer, Lord chose to invest in infrastructure over players, spending £200,000 on the matchday facilities at Turf Moor with the aim of increasing revenue from higher attendances. He likely thought the former champions, who Jimmy Adamson had captained to second in the league and the 1962 FA Cup final, were on the cusp of more success. Things were looking up for the club, until, for reasons still not fully understood, the following season, Lord made the decision to sell arguably the best player in Burnley's history, Jimmy McIlroy. McIlroy was sold to Stoke City in February 1963 and is seen by many to this day as the end of the Burnley glory era. The seasons went by with Lord being firm in his philosophy of only using internal staff and young players being brought through. This reluctance to sign outside senior players persevered until the arrival of 22-year-old winger Frank Casper for £27,000 in 1967. The replacement for Harry Potts even came from within Burnley, appointing former player Jimmy Adamson as manager in 1970. The club had been stagnant with 4 14th place finishes in a row, so it was hoped fresh management could break this trend. The trend was indeed broken, because in Adamson's first season, Burnley finished 21st and were relegated to the second division. But Bob Lord is famous for inventing the phrase "trust the process" and stuck by Adamson. It took 2 years in the second division, but Adamson had built a team ready for another top flight adventure. The young team, many of whom had won the prestigious FA Youth Cup in 1968, led by players such as Martin Dobson and Leighton James, then made an immediate impact upon their return to the first division, finishing 6th in their first season, only missing out on European football on average goals. Despite the overachievement in 73-74, the club's finances were beginning to suffer. Lord was acutely aware that Burnley were punching above their weight in the division, so sought to reinforce their position and increase revenue again through infrastructure investment. He likely thought the youthful team would improve, and subsequently so would attendances. He commissioned the rebuilding of one of the main stands at Burnley, increasing the capacity at Turf Moor to 42,000, twice the average gates at the time. Bob Lord then named the stand the Bob Lord Stand. This project led to the club posting losses of £220,000. To balance the books, Martin Dobson was sold to Everton for 300 grand, to which Lord proclaimed the sale as the latest step in a policy which is keeping Burnley in the First Division. Fans at the time were understandably upset to see one of their best players and club captain leave in exchange for arguably an unnecessary stand. One disgruntled fan wrote to the local press to ask Lord, "Do you want a successful side or the best ground in the 4th Division?" By 75-76, the club again found itself in a relegation battle, and the optimism surrounding the club had vanished. Star player Leighton James put in a transfer request and, on his way out, stated the club lacked ambition. Jimmy Adamson was asked by the board to resign in January 1976, and relegation to the 2nd Division subsequently followed in that May. Harry Potts was reappointed manager for 76-77 in the hope of basically doing what had worked the last 2 times, using youth to gain promotion to, and then subsequently compete in, the top division. But at this point, fans were beginning to turn on Bob Lord. The club was experiencing 6-figure losses for several years, and to make the situation work, the youth conveyor belt was drying up. A 16th, 11th and 13th place finishes were deemed unacceptable, and at the start of the 79-80 season, Potts was relieved of his duties. His replacement was 1960 title veteran Brian Miller. Miller finished the job of relegating Burnley to the 3rd Division. Miller would keep his role despite relegation and finished 8th in his first full season. In 1981-82, Burnley made no new signings and turned down an offer from future Liverpool legend John Aldridge for a trial. Despite the lack of transfers, Burnley did well. The trust placed in Miller was rewarded, and by the close of 1982, Burnley were back in the 2nd Division. Notable during that season in 1981 saw the removal of Bob Lord as chairman in September. He later became seriously ill with cancer, which would ultimately take his life in December of 1981. Life in the 2nd tier wasn't kind to Burnley, and by mid-January, Burnley decided they had given Miller enough time, and he was dismissed. Frank Casper was appointed as interim manager, who finished the job of getting Burnley relegated back to the 3rd Division after a single season. At this point, Burnley's fall was hard to ignore. Within 22 years, the team had gone from champions to struggling to escape the 3rd tier. The club needed a new approach away from the youthful recruitment which had dried up. The response was an external manager with a fresh approach was needed. The board's choice was former Manchester City manager John Bond, the first manager not previously associated with Burnley for 31 years. Bond was back to the best of the club's ability in terms of acquisition of new players. TSB became both a personal bank and sponsor of the club that season. Over 150 grand was spent in the summer, and bids of the same amount for star player Hamilton were rejected. To put this into perspective, season ticket sales at the time totaled £76,000 annually. So a lot was being spent, but the club had likely gone too far from their youthful route, as there seemed to be a lack of talent identification at the club. Bond sold future Premier League player Brian Laws to Huddersfield for 20 grand, and let future Arsenal legend Lee Dixon leave on a free transfer. The result of Bond's management, as well as the new acquisition, was an 11th place finish. Bond was backed again in the close season, and another swarm of new arrivals arrived. But just before the 84-85 season began, Bond came out with a statement regarding the club. "All I want to do is manage the club in my own way, as I have done at my previous clubs. But I am afraid that this is an impossibility for any manager when there is friction between himself and the chairman." 5 days before the start of the season, Bond was gone. The John Bond experiment clearly had not worked. He said 25 years later it was the greatest regret of his career, and to this day Bond is still looked upon unfavourably by Burnley fans for his acquisitions, prioritising older players he used to work with, many of whom were physically in decline at that stage. The 84-85 season was doomed from the start, and Burnley were again in a relegation battle. Going into the last match day, they were relying on Swansea losing their last game of the season in order to survive. Swansea manager at the time was a Mr. John Bond. Bond finished the job he had started in pre-season by getting a draw to ensure Burnley finished 21st and were relegated to the 4th Division for the first time ever. In the same issue of the Burnley Express covering the relegation, there was an article celebrating 25 years to the day of Burnley becoming English champions. 1985-86 saw the club have mixed results, finishing 14th. The fall of 3 divisions and subsequent reduction in match attendances, despite having the highest attendances in the 4th Division, was beginning to take its toll on the business. The debts had become unserviceable. Balance sheet showed the club was making losses of 250 grand a year, with 650 grand owed in debts or to creditors. Reviewing the data years later shows the club was anywhere from 4 days to 24 hours for being put into receivership. Eventually, a group of local businessmen bought the club, giving assurances the club would exist for one more season, and sponsors agreed to pay for the next few seasons in advance. Players on expiring contracts could simply not be offered renewals. By the end of the 85-86 season, the club were in a dire situation, having been 24 hours from dissolving, but the season after, they were 90 minutes from such fate. For 1986-87, the Football League introduced the prospect of automatic relegation to the Conference, the fifth tier considered non-league football. This was done to help boost attendances and give more stakes to lower league clubs. I'm sure this change will have no impact on Burnley, who were playing top division football just 11 years earlier. Burnley reappointed Brian Miller as manager, who at the time was running a newspaper shop. Miller was given instructions that he could recruit 4 players on free deals, which included the return of Leighton James, as well as Chelsea legend Ian Britton. Neil Grucock was due to leave the club, with a deal to Bolton falling apart due to personal terms. Burnley started the 1986-87 season moderately well, all things considered, with 1 loss in their first 7 league games. Although if you've got this far, you may have noticed a trend in that there's a bit of hope followed by disaster. This is no exception. The ageing squad and lack of qualities led Burnley to a run of 12 losses in 18 games. To sum up this season and Burnley's downfall in a metaphor, we have the story of Tony Woodworth. At the end of the run of 12 losses in 18 games, Burnley's first choice keeper, Joe Neenan, was injured, so youngster Tony Woodworth was given his debut against Hereford at home. Burnley lost 6-0 and Woodworth never played professionally again. Burnley were looking at another relegation battle. A quick reminder that 26 years earlier, Burnley were in the equivalent of the Champions League, competing with the best teams in Europe. Form did improve a bit, 1 loss in 7. By that I mean, they lost 1, drew 6, won none. Burnley then matched their winning streak from early in that season, 2 wins on the bounce. Burnley then achieved another season's best, 4 losses on the bounce. A run of patchy form led to the events of the last game of the season. On the morning of the 9th of May 1987, Burnley found themselves in an unenviable position, bottom of the Football League with 1 game to go. Finishing 24th would mean relegation to non-league football, and with the club already in a precarious position financially, likely would mean the club would fold. To survive, Burnley would need to beat playoff-pushing Orient at Turf Moor and hope either relegation rival Torquay or Lincoln lost. It became known as the Orient Game. The town knew the stakes of this match. News companies covered the game extensively. The town came out in force with 17,600 fans attending the game, 3 times higher than that season's previous best and 6 times above the average for the season. As the clock struck 3 PM, they knew it was now or never for Burnley. Even a win might not be enough. The crowds had an impact before kick-off. Due to the large attendances, kick-off was delayed for 15 minutes whilst fans came inside. This was an advantage to Burnley, as their, Lincoln and Torquay's games were all planned to kick off at the same time. This meant Burnley would know their results before their game finished. Before the Clarets kicked a ball, both the Imps and Gulls were losing. Their game kicked off, being a cagey affair between both teams. The nerves were on show between both teams. Burnley survived several Orient attacks before, in the dying second of the first half, Neil Grucock cut inside from the right to score. Burnley were halfway there and, after the break, Ian Britton headed in a second in the 48th minute. But Orient had their own ambitions and 8 minutes later, they made the game 2-1 with an Alan Comfort effort. Burnley had just over half an hour to hold on or lose its place in the Football League after 100 years. On the stroke of just after 4:50 PM, Lincoln lost and Torquay drew. This meant Burnley required a win to survive, but it was in their own hands. The game finished 2-1. Burnley had finished 90th out of 92 in the Football League. Fans stormed the pitch, knowing their beloved club had survived for at least another year.
From the celebrations, it looked as though Burnley had won the league, but at least next season they'll still be playing in it.
Well, we've got what we wanted, we've to build from here, and God willing, we'll have the same support next season. That's all we can ask for.
After the Orient game, Burnley began the slow climb back up the football pyramid. The club was re-galvanised the following season by a run to the Football League Trophy final against Wolverhampton Wanderers. Despite losing, the team were greeted by thousands of Burnley fans at Turf Moor, upon their return from Wembley. Maybe the fans, having seen how close the club came to oblivion, coupled with the cup run, gained a greater appreciation for what they had, in the same way you appreciate a relative more who was ill for a long period of time. This support likely gave the team the spark to complete the great climb up the divisions. Under Jimmy Mullins, Burnley won the 4th Division in 1992, becoming the first team to win the top 4 divisions in England. The club would spend the next 8 years fluttering between the 2nd and 3rd Division until an Ian Wright-led swan song saw promotion from the 3rd tier in 2000. Burnley stayed in the Championship for 9 years until manager Owen Coyle took the team to the playoff final against Sheffield United at Wembley on the 25th of May 2009, completing the 33-year journey back to the top of English football.
22 years ago, they were 90 minutes away from non-league football. The story is complete, the dream is complete, and Burnley are there. They're in the Premiership.